Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Empowered to Advocate podcast. This is Dana Marie, and I am coming to you solo today with a mini episode. After this week, we are going to take a couple of weeks break from the podcast to prepare for some really exciting episodes we have in March and April. But today we have a fairly timely topic and time-sensitive topic, so we wanted to make sure that we got it to you today. Today, I'm going to give you 5 things that you need to know about the MCAS assessment and how it impacts your child with a disability and on an IEP. So first of all, before I jump in, what are the MCAS? The MCAS stands for the Massachusetts Comprehensive Assessment System, and students begin taking these assessments in early elementary school to determine competency based on standards. Now, the first thing that I want to come to you with information about is the graduation requirement. As many of you know, the MCAS is a graduation requirement in the state of Massachusetts. So in order to receive a high school diploma, students need to pass the 10th grade English Language Arts assessment, the 10th grade mathematics assessment, and one of the high school science, technology, and engineering assessments. Then this information is important because even if you have a child in elementary school, in your annual IEP meetings, review meetings, you should be talking about what this means for your child as they enter into high school and have to take the assessments that will actually count towards graduation. Now, there are nuances to this. There are opportunities to retest and retake the assessment if your child does not pass on the first try. There are also other avenues for appeal for certain situations and circumstances. But overall, most students in the state of Massachusetts will sit for the on-demand MCAS assessment in 10th grade in order to help determine competency and help determine their high school graduation and diploma. The second thing that you need to know, therefore, is every single year, like I said before, you should be talking about the MCAS as early as 2nd grade. As students begin the transition into 3rd grade, you should be discussing what this means for your child. Will they be taking the typical traditional on-demand MCAS? Do they qualify to take the alternate MCAS, the portfolio MCAS? What accommodations will they need in order to be able to take the assessment? Which specific assessment will they be taking? Does your child require a paper-based assessment versus an electronic assessment? There are so many questions to be answered about your specific child and their individual needs as they relate to taking this test. And so the second thing that I want you to make sure that's happening is that every year the team is reviewing what that means for your child to sit for the MCAS assessment. As part of this conversation, the team should actually be using the state's decision making tool. So the state's decision making tool determines if your child will take the typical traditional MCAS with accommodations or if they qualify for the alternate assessment, like I said before. So that brings me to number 3. The alternate assessment is a conversation that should also be happening every single year. So even if your child took the alternate assessment or did a portfolio assessment in 3rd grade, that does not mean for the rest of their educational career that will be the assessment they will be participating in. That can change annually, and it should certainly be discussed annually. Along the same lines, if your team, your student's team, your child's team determines that perhaps your child would be better served with the alternate assessment because their disability impacts their ability to access the on-demand traditional assessment, you should be thinking about and asking questions about whether that means for one subject or for every subject. You should be making a different determination for each subject. So an example of this may be that your child may not be able to participate in the traditional MCAS assessment for ELA, but the team determines that your child may be able to participate with accommodations for the mathematics assessment that is a conversation that you can be having. And just because you have an alternate assessment in one subject area does not necessarily you need to have it in the other. So making sure that you're discussing each subject area, as of course every child can access different academics in different subjects in different ways. The fourth thing that I want to talk about today is that, and this comes up, I have to be honest, often in conversations. If you have a child with a significant disability who perhaps is placed in a substantially separate classroom, perhaps has an intellectual disability or another disability that impacts them being able to access the general education curriculum at their grade level, that does not necessarily automatically mean that they will be taking the alternate assessment. There are no requirements based on disability category. There are no requirements based on which classroom or which program your child is placed in. Instead, like I said before, you should be using a decision-making tool, the state decision-making tool, every single time you have the conversation at an annual meeting about the MCAS. I say all of this to say it's not automatic. So just because your child has a specific disability or is placed in a specific classroom or program does not automatically mean they take one assessment or the other. It is incredibly individualized and should be an individualized conversation every single year. The last thing that I want to mention is that there are lots of accommodations that can be added to your child's IEP to support them in taking the MCAS assessment. So I say all of that to say, once again, this is a conversation that should be happening every single year. Those accommodations should be added to the IEP. They should be reviewed annually. You should see which ones your child is using in their classroom during their typical school day, and then which ones they will need to sit and take the assessment. Some examples are speech to text would be a good example of an accommodation that a student can use on the MCAS. Another accommodation that might be helpful for your particular child is a separate location, a smaller group, a familiar test administrator, and the list honestly goes on and on. There are general accommodations, and then there are special accommodations for students who require a little bit more support in taking the assessment. So when the team is determining annually which assessment your child will take, they should also be determining which accommodations will be necessary for your child to take the assessment. Now, all of that said, and this is a little bit of a caveat, what's really important and another reason why this conversation should be ongoing is that if your child is going to use accommodations on the MCAS assessment in the spring, they should be using those accommodations all year long to get used to it, right? So it shouldn't just be on the day of the assessment that they are pulled out for the first time to work in a small group, or they are using speech to text for the first time ever, or perhaps they're using a graphic organizer that they've never seen or they've never seen anything like it. That is not super helpful and won't be a helpful accommodation. This should be something that your child uses across the school year and across subject areas in order to feel prepared going into that test. So just a quick review of the 5 things that we talked about today. Number 1, the MCAS is a graduation requirement in the state of Massachusetts, 10th grade ELA, mathematics, and one of the high school science, technology, and engineering assessments. Number 2, all of these conversations should be reviewed annually. You should be talking as early as 2nd grade about the MCAS every single year at every annual review meeting and or reevaluation meeting. Number 3, there are criteria for students who are participating in the alternate assessment. You should be using the decision-making tool, and it should not be automatic based on your child's disability or their placement, their classroom, where they're doing most of their learning. And then finally, accommodations, something that should also be reviewed annually. There are accommodations that students can be using on the MCAS to help support them in taking this assessment. Those accommodations should be used all year long. They should be things that the student are familiar with. So that was a lot of information in less than 10 minutes today. If you have specific questions about your child, whether they are taking the appropriate assessment, whether they are getting the appropriate accommodations in order to pass the assessment, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. We will actually drop in the show notes today some links to important information on the state's website regarding the MCAS, but it is dense. There is a lot of information. So if you have specific questions about your child, about the assessment coming up in the spring, please do not hesitate to reach out. And like I said, we will be back in a couple of weeks with some new and exciting episodes. And until then, we hope that you are well, and we look forward to chatting with you in March. Thanks, everyone.